Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? I'm going to keep this intro pretty short. I mean, I always keep it relatively short, but, I'm exhausted. I had to take the cat in for his chemotherapy appointment he gets every 3 weeks. He's doing fine. Put on some weight. Kidney value stable. He's in total remission, but he still has to have it every 3 weeks. And, it's a lot. So I want to get into the episode because this was wonderful. Today's guest is Susan Coyne. And if you don't know who Susan is, I'm going to read you her bio right now. Originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, playwright and TV writer Susan Coyne studied intellectual history before pivoting to acting. She acted in several seasons of the Stratford Festival, which was formerly known as the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, and then became a playwright. In the early aughts, Susan, along with Mark McKinney and Bob Martin, created the brilliant TV show Slings and Arrows, and over the 3 seasons won numerous Gemini Awards for writing and acting in the show. Since then, Susan has worked in TV and film both in the US and Canada, and most recently wrote on Mozart in the Jungle and Daisy Jones and the Six, which I enjoyed very much. And yes, for months afterwards, could you have heard me blasting the Fleetwood Mackie soundtrack as I drove around LA? Yes. But recently, I was doing a rewatch of Slings and Arrows, and I was like, oh man, I love this show so much. I wonder if I can talk to the creators. And Susan was so nice! And we get into some real deep stuff, real philosophical stuff, real existential stuff. The usual on the show, but, some guests want to go deeper. Some guests are happy swimming near the surface. But Susan, we went deep, almost right from the beginning. And I just thought this was a lovely talk, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, I've been doing the show over 14 years, and I would love if you would check out some other episodes. Now, 14 years, that's a lot of episodes. So in this intro here, I like to do a little recommended if you like. And I've talked to hundreds of musicians and writers and actors and performers and comedians and journalists and so on and so forth. So grab an episode at random if you want, troll through the back catalog, or I can tell you some people. Susan's a writer. What about other writers I've had on the show? Terry Winter, creator of Boardwalk Empire, writer on The Sopranos. Ron D. Moore, creator of the new Battlestar Galactica. Damon Lindelof, a lot of stuff, but my favorite is The Leftovers. Leslie Headland, creator of Russian Doll, along with Natasha Lyonne. Cord Jefferson just won an Oscar. He's been on the show before. Scott Thompson. Let's talk about fellow Canadians. Now, Mark McKinney from Kids in the Hall wrote Slings and Arrows with Susan. Well, I've had Scott Thompson from Kids in the Hall on. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the show. You can find me on social media, mostly Instagram and Blue Sky these days, at Andy Beckerman. And coming up, a lot of great episodes, a lot of indie rock bands I like, but also, hey, if we're talking writers, Jim Mickens. I just talked to him. He show ran Happen Leonard, show run Sweet Tooth, and directed a film I love, Cold in July. And that was a great talk, so look forward to that. But for now, let's talk to Susan. My cat is sitting on my lap. We're like, he's been very clingy. His brother died last year, and once he figured it out, it took him a couple months. But ever since then, he just can't be alone, and it's very sad.
Wow, that's so they're so mysterious animals, aren't they?
It's so frustrating. I don't have children. I don't know if you have children, but
I do.
I have to imagine it's a little easier because at some point you can explain things to a child.
Right.
You can never. They don't have. I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, the difference between humans and most other animals is symbolic competence. We understand symbols and they don't understand symbols.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, so they don't understand. They understand affection, but they don't understand love because there's a. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. I realize that we're jumping straight into philosophical content, which is maybe not what you signed up for. But I just realized, I'm like, oh yeah, affection, sure, they get it, but not love. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a weird, like, I can't, anyway, sorry. So that's,
Probably because they don't know they're going to die.
I mean, yeah, the horizon of, sure, that's deep. Like, I was a philosophy professor before I got into
Oh, wow.
the entertainment racket. And that, like Heidegger, who maybe not so popular since he was a Nazi, but I like his philosophy still. There's a concept there called being towards death, which I'm a fan of, because it's really like when you orient yourself, when you understand the horizon of your own life, you act meaningfully, but then you can't live like that. So you forget about it. And then you're just like, playing mobile games on your phone. And then you're like, oh, wait, right, I'm going to die. And then you act meaningfully again. And then you're
Right.
kind of constantly bouncing back and forth between those things.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
At least ideally.
Yeah.
I wonder. If we're already here in this deep end, like, what do you think is the ratio of acting meaningfully in your own life versus, oh, I have to do these chores, or I have to do my taxes or whatever?
Wow. I think temperamentally, I get bored doing things that aren't kind of meaningful in some level. I really don't even, I get the appeal of it, but I don't play games on my phone because I'm like, well, I could be doing something else that's kind of more connected to things that are really interesting to me. Sometimes I feel like that's a problem. I don't play enough games, but I studied history and intellectual history in university, and then, like you, I made a non-traditional U-turn and went into acting, and then went into writing and so on. But I'm interested in ideas. I'm interested in meaning. I think it's when there's so many things you could be doing, it's sort of a helpful way of choosing, I guess. It's like what, and also I feel it's more fun for me to find things that are meaningful.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is why I neglect my taxes, because they don't mean as much as they should. I'm trying to find a meaning in them somehow.
No, I get you. And what ends up happening is that I'll end up like doing something very meaningful. And actually, like, I'm curious about yourself. If it's almost, for me sometimes, if it's so real, and I don't have a better word for that at the moment, but capital R real. If I'm seeing a piece of art, a film, a painting, something that like seems to speak to such a deep truth, it's almost terrifying in a way. Very like, almost like the sublime, like the old kind of understanding of what the sublime was. And I flee from it a little bit into, I got to wash the dishes, or I got to, and I'm wondering, does the same thing happen to you? Do you not flee? Like, what is going on when you see a piece of art that really, or when you do anything where you find it meaningful, capital M meaningful? Like, what's going on inside, I guess?
Oh, it's a good question. I find that here's a sort of trivial answer, but maybe it's connected. When I'm watching a show that I really love, I can't binge it. I have to watch it one at a time because I need to process it, and I need to figure out how my atoms have changed after watching that. Even like I have enjoyed film festivals, but I also find them overwhelming because I'm like, I really need to process. I need to go for a long walk. I need to talk about, I need to do something about that, I guess, if that's connected to what you're talking about. I'm a ruminator, so I like to think about how I've been changed, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
Or travel, or things that, I've been on a canoe trip to the high north in Canada, and it was so amazing because it was just being for 2 weeks in this amazing scenery and not thinking about where you were going, but also just absorbing and kind of, I don't know, whatever it was very sort of sublime. At the same time, there's a lot of chores involved in staying alive, but I think I do look for those opportunities to have an experience that will feel like you're metamorphosizing somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think for me at least, you saying that I think part of the sublime part of it is the fact that it changes you. When you actually engage in meaningful activities, they change you, and you come out the other side of it a slightly different person, at least a slightly different person, so that you have to kind of take it in and be like, okay, now I am regarding the world in a different way, or I am engaged, or I relate to the world in a different way, and I have to figure out what this new way is, even if it's just slightly, like watching, a TV show or a film, as opposed to, being in nature for weeks at a time and having that change you, right?
Or when you go through big life events, you hope. I mean, a lot of people, and I'm sure I was one of them, when I had my first child, I thought, but this isn't going to change me, which is the most ridiculous thing, because why do you have a child? Why do you get married? Why do you do anything if you're not expecting to be changed by such a momentous, event? Then you really could live your life without ever having really been here. So it's not just art, obviously. It's big moments in life that, I don't know, I wonder if everybody's that interested in experiencing change, or if some people are undoubtedly like, no, not for me, thank you. I'm sure.
I mean,
that's what we write about as characters. We write about people who really don't want to change until they have to. That's the kind of intersection when you meet them. It's like, I'm not going to take that ride, and then they have to take the ride.
I mean, I don't know how it is in Canada, but at least here in America, I think people are extreme. Sorry, I'm about to state like a universal, and then my brain is just like, come on, Andy, that stating universal is you're always going to find a lot of counterexamples. How about this? The statistical trend, it feels like, anecdotally, there's my caveat, is that, do you ever, sorry, here's a parenthetical. I took Latin when I was younger, and so I want to pronounce, when I say a Latin word, I want to pronounce my V's as W's, because that's how they're pronounced.
Wene widi wiki?
Yeah.
Exactly. I took Latin, too.
Caveat. I almost go caveat, and then I stop myself, and I'm like, nope, it's normally pronounced caveat. I think people are, and parenthetical, I think people tend to be resistant to change in general, and tend to flee from meaningful activity in general. At least here in America. At least that's how it seems. And I don't know if that's how it feels in Canada, either now or, when you were growing up. Or
very much. It's a very conservative country for the most part, really. Like small c conservative, centrist conservative. But I think it's the human nature, actually. Like, I think just as you were saying, this push-pull between remembering you're going to die and cheerfully forgetting it, I think we don't really, we want change, but change we can manage. But change that's huge and catastrophic, or that's like challenges everything you thought about the world, or that make you feel like it's chaos out there, I think we're not so keen to go looking for those changes, even though that's where the good stuff is usually. That's where you really start to learn what the world is really like. So I think it's a human nature thing, actually, to think, yeah, I like change. I mean, I can cope with change. Like I watched a new show and it's about people I've never heard of. So, but to really take change on is more what you're talking about. It's kind of terrifying and sublime and awful, and you think you might, have altered your DNA in some way. So, and it could be love, or it could be the death of a loved one. It could be both, I think. Lots of people don't, when you find yourself falling in love, you think, oh no, this is terrifying. Oh no, this isn't what I thought it would be.
I think there's at least a facet of it, I wonder if this resonates with you at least, that there is a kind of melancholy or mourning involved in change, because as you're a different person, you then have to mourn the person you were in some way, even if it's just a fraction of, like, every time that you engage in something meaningful, you don't necessarily consciously do that, but I wonder if that's a tinge of it, and why it is like, oh no, right?
So I started off in theater as an actor, and I've seen I've been in a lot of plays and I've seen a lot of plays. And there's a great line in Major Barbara by Shaw where the main character says to Major Barbara, "You've learned something. That always feels like a loss." And I think it's so succinct for that kind of thing you're saying is it is a loss. You have to let go of that childish or immature or incorrect view of the world. And so you feel young and kind of at sea again somehow.
Ooh. Oh, yeah, that's great. Okay, and actually this is a good entree because you had said you had studied intellectual history and then you moved into theater. And I'm curious if that was a fraught decision or if it was easy to do that for you.
It was easy because I realized when I started to get into acting that, you were an academic. I thought very briefly, should I go on in history? But to me, I thought, the world will just get smaller and smaller in some ways, from my point of view. Whereas when I went into theater, I thought, everything is now of interest. Everything is useful. Everything is interesting. Everything is part of the story. Your whole experience, your whole life experience, including your ability to think and your ability to feel. And going into, I've trained as a classical actor, so that kind of time travel that I got out of studying history, I was even more, and also I always loved literature, so I felt I was right inside the book so for me it was actually kind of an extension of a deeper desire to be connected to the past and using every part of me in some way.
Did you always have that desire and you didn't think you could follow it? Was it unconscious and you suddenly realized it at a moment? Or a third possibility?
Yeah, like every kid, I did theater in high school, and you think, well, okay, you don't really do that. And it didn't seem, this is sort of embarrassing, it didn't seem like intellectually respectable or something. So I did what did what all my family did and got a, arts degree, and then they all went on to law, most of them were business or something, but I took a year to think about it and thought, and took some classes and thought, this really actually makes me happy for some reason doing this. So it was kind of just following the next thing and seeing see whether it would go anywhere and getting into a conservatory and then finding that, these weirdos are my people and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't a clear trajectory. It was kind of following the next thing and somehow feeling like I had all the time in the world, which now I think I was in school for 8 years. I could be delivering babies instead of learning period dance and dialects.
But would you have been happy delivering babies? You could have.
I don't know. Yeah, probably not. Probably I would have found my way to that if that was what was really... Isn't it funny? People are really... as I get older, I really think, people really are different. People really come into this world with a desire to tinker with cars or something. That's their passion. And they're not kidding. That's really what makes them happy. So isn't it interesting how different people are? And you can't really explain it.
Well, I try to. I attempt to. But I do like talking about trajectories because I also think about a lot of things like, I was reading about your family and I was thinking about like your grandfather is a judge, right? And then your father was in the government. And I was thinking about, was there any pressure? Was there any familial pressure, either overt or just feeling the thrum of history pushing you in a certain direction? Yeah,
they're more internal. I certainly was the outlier. I was also the sensitive one and the... But yeah, again, all of my family have gone on to do other things that are more sort of in keeping with the family history. So yeah, it was a bit of a weird thing. But both my mom she just recently died. Okay. She was very artistic. She loved to paint, and she had done theater in her youth, and so I think probably she understood it on a gut level. And my dad was he was a very wise person and he said to my mom at one point, well, when I got into theater school, well, I guess if anyone has a heart's desire and they have the opportunity to pursue it, then I guess they're lucky. So, which was such a wise, beautiful thing for a very quite reserved person to say.
Wow. Do you think they did what they wanted to do?
Oh, so interesting. I do think so. I think that was a gift that they gave me, that they were largely doing what really meant something to them. So in some ways, they gave me that gift, I think. That's not that usual, maybe, but for them, I think, even though, they had sort of unusual lives that way, I think. You know, my dad was a bachelor till he was 47 years old.
Huh.
And he married my mom, and I think he really, at 47, thought, I really want kids. And he married my mom, who was then a widow with 3 small children. And then they had 2 more right away. And so he spent half his life as a bachelor and half his life as a father of 5. Then we were all, grew up together. And I just keep thinking about what an extraordinary thing to go from the one quiet, calm, career government civil servant, and then going in, having this whole other life with 5 children.
Wait, what changed for him at 47? Because that seems like not that you can't change at any point in your life, but like, what is it at 47 that seems like a real shift, a real existential
I know. It truly is. It's extraordinary. And I don't know if any of us, I know it was, my mom used to say, because people would say, oh, he married her in spite of the children. She said, he married me because of the children. He was looking for, I think he was looking for meaning, actually. He was looking for this other level of meaning, and was boy, we're getting into some really deep waters here, but I think was kind of like extraordinarily brave to say, okay, I'm going to try it. Amazing, eh?
How did they meet then?
They met through friends, and they were married. They dated like 5 or 6 times, and they were married within a year. Like, again, just a complete intuitive, I guess this is what we're doing, and isn't that amazing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, like, my parents
she was 17 years younger as well, which was the other part of the story. You said your parents are like that too?
Yeah, they met, I think they were married within 9 months or something like that. Amazing. I wasn't born, so just so we're clear, I was not born for another 6 years, so it was not, they were not forced to.
Yeah.
But that was in the early 70s that they got married. It just seems like my wife and I we were together for 13 years before we got married.
Yeah, we're also cautious these days, and I don't think it makes any difference whether you just go on instinct or go on, like there's some kind of magic alchemy to it. Because my parents were together my dad was 102 when he died.
Whoa.
So they were together for 55 years or something like that.
Whoa.
Amazing.
So you had a pretty stable childhood, it seems, then.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Did that give you a basis to kind of... See, there's so many... Sorry, I was about to ask a question. I will ask it, but I'm going to throw in another parenthetical here. There's no necessity to things, because I was about to ask, did that give you the space to kind of be yourself? But I've talked to so many people who have chaotic childhoods that gave them the space to do their own thing. So let me just ask it like this then. How do you think the stability affected you? Did it allow you certain things? Did it take away because you were constantly doing family activities? It
was a bit of both. It was a big, noisy family. A lot of activity, actually. We moved around a certain amount. There were, it was sort of cheerful chaos, but it was sort of chaos. And my mom was out of the house a lot of time. She went back to school, got a fine arts degree. My dad ended up being the house husband, who was home when we got there. So there were a lot of things that were kind of unusual about it. So I think I found in that kind of chaos, I found it, my happy place was under the dining room table and reading. So it was a little bit of both in a way. But, and staying, out of the line of fire if somebody was getting in trouble was another, because you can imagine, like, very active, especially my older siblings, very active, very sort of pushing boundaries. And so I found my happy place, as I say, under the dining room table reading a book.
Do you think that is how your brain was set up? Just the architecture of your brain, and you kind of followed it out? Or do you think it was in some way a reaction to seeing your siblings kind of push the boundaries? And also, I guess as a side question, what does that mean, push the boundaries for them?
Oh, they were always sort of testing the rules and, sneaking out late at night and all the things, the normal things.
Right.
And,
Not
arguing.
Like stealing cars.
Fighting. Don't think so. I haven't heard any of those stories yet. No, they were well within that kind of, pushing the boundaries for a mother of 5, let's say, who's trying to keep things under control. It's a really good question. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that. Though somebody once said, somebody else I know who comes from a large family says every child kind of swims for the open sea. Like, how do I find my thing if someone else is doing that? If they're the bad child, maybe I'll be the good child or whatever. I don't know. It's interesting. It's an endless mystery. There's part of it's, my mom, I was very emotional when I was growing up and quite like, they called me the fastest cry in the West because I grew up in the West. My older siblings, and got teased a lot. And then my brother was very argumentative, my younger brother. And so, my mom was always sort of trying to correct these, imbalances. But I became an actress and my brother became a political journalist. So you can't, children are born with their basic natures, it seems, and you can't really change them.
But here's the thing. Okay, this is what I find so fascinating endlessly is that, okay, what if they had disciplined that out of you or made you feel shame for being emotional or something like that? Maybe it would have taken you longer to find theater, or maybe you never would have found theater because you were too repressed to.
That's true. That's very true. I would have become a very emotional lawyer in my office.
Right.
And then very hard-edged, litigator, but go back like Holly Hunter and unplug the phone and cry for 20 minutes.
Exactly. Like I knew, okay, so it took me forever. And my parents didn't discipline this stuff out of me, but I just had this thing in my head that I had to have a stable job. And so anything that was unstable just never entered my field of thought. And until I just had a kind of like existential crisis, and I had to pursue what I really wanted. I had to discover it. I had to excavate it out from under a bunch of. And
what was that? What was that you really wanted? You had your stable job was being a prof, and then
I wanted to do. I had been doing. Once I got to college, I was in a band with a friend of mine, and I was like, oh. Making art is amazing, and making art the way I want to, as opposed to the way that I was told to make it in school. And I can do whatever I want, and people like it. Oh, this is really fulfilling and meaningful. And then I'm like, but I guess I can't really do this. And so I kind of like pushed it down, and then you just can only do that for so long. It just, once you repress something, I mean, this is just so basic Freudian, you repress it, just comes out in weird ways, and you're just like crying in the stairwell or whatever. And you're like, right. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, because I want to be making stuff.
Where did you grow up? What city?
Reading, Pennsylvania, which is a small city. It's a city, but it's a small city in between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, which is the capital of Pennsylvania.
It's probably a lot like where I grew up, Winnipeg, which is a kind of Midwestern, very stable place to come from, like good place to grow up, but not where you. Because one of the reasons I ask is like when I was growing up, I just think how much economies, whatever's happening in the economy can affect your ability to take chances. Because when I got out of theater school and came to Toronto, rent was quite cheap. You could live on what you made in theater. You get a couple of days on a TV show. Like, it wasn't as big a risk as it is now, which is a troubling thing. It means that, like, a lot of young people can't take that risk because it's just impossible to make a living at it and to spend the time that you need to develop your skills and so on. But there was a time in I guess this would have been the 80s, when it was, big cities were, like Toronto, were still relatively affordable. And now back in Winnipeg, where I'm come from, that's still the case. And there's a huge kind of art and theater and music scene there because people end up moving back there because it's affordable and they can take, be their do sort of big risky things and grow as artists. So it's one of the things that I feel concerned about, because I have kids who are in the arts too, and I can see how much harder it is for them.
I remember there was a story going around social media a couple of weeks ago about Philip Glass and how the way that he could survive in the 70s was he would drive a cab for about a week, that he would earn his rent and all his money that he needed for the entire month, and then he could spend the other 3 weeks composing.
Yeah.
And that even when he made some appearance in the late 70s or maybe early 80s on Saturday Night Live, and he was still driving a cab when he did that performance.
Amazing.
Or maybe it was an appearance. I think it was with David Byrne. I'm not exactly sure of the circumstances. But and I remember that engendering a lot of talk from actors or from musicians, who created, like in New York, like the downtown art scene, talking about we could do that because rent was it was incredibly affordable to live there, and so we could spend most of our time creating.
Yeah, it's worrying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm like, I look at when I talk to people on the show that are younger than me, or friends of mine that are younger than me, I'm like, really, it was fraught for me to take the risk.
Yeah,
and I really had to spend a lot of time doing temp jobs and a lot of other kinds of things I wasn't thrilled with. My big story is like, 1 month I had to sell my guitar to pay for rent in New York, and that's my great story, And I'm like, how obviously people like, I think of Kafka, right, who wrote, worked at a bank and then wrote at night and stuff like that. But it's still, it takes so much energy to make things that it naturally, like, the more it takes, the more it costs economically to do it, the more it's going to, like a colander, like more people are going to fall through.
For
that
sure.
metaphor is very rickety, but
I got where you're going.
So what was Winnipeg like when you were growing up? Winnipeg in the 70s, say. I only know it from the Guy Madden film, so I'm not.
Yeah, it's spot on. That's exactly, It's fun to go to see a Guy Madden film with a bunch of people from Winnipeg because they're howling at the in-jokes, because it was a wonderfully stable place where a lot of weirdos come from, because you could really be. It was a strangely accommodating place, and it was very sophisticated for a small town that's very isolated in the middle of the prairies, and it's largely because of all the waves of immigrants that came from Europe and brought culture. And there's a really good theater center and a really good ballet and a really good opera and art gallery. There's one of everything, and you could easily do all those things, and it wasn't extraordinarily expensive. It wasn't thought to be a weird thing to do. Everybody did everything, basically. And because the winters are long and cold, people go out of the house and they support the arts. They want to get out and do things. So there's a lot of really interesting, artists who have come from there, musicians who've come there and then come back. And I think it was such a gift to grow up there, actually, because again, like reading under the dining room table, you could get away with it, basically. It wasn't thought to be that weird or strange, or you do that, I do this, we play hockey, whatever.
Was there any particular art, whether a play or an opera, anything that piqued your interest when you were younger?
There was a really good theater company that I took classes at. It had 2 stages, and it was a top-quality regional theater that had, people came from all over North America to perform there, so that really piqued my interest. And then taking classes in this little funny theater school above the stage, so you'd walk across the warehouse stage to go to take your classes. It all felt very accessible, you know what I mean? In later years, I was part of a group of people who started a theater company here in Toronto. And one of the things we wanted to do was give young people that sense of it's accessible. The doors are open. You come in, you walk across the stage, you belong here. And I had that feeling somehow of the people who taught there made it feel that it was something you could do in a way, I guess, or that you belonged there in some level. It's hard to say, but that's a thing that was really important when we were starting the theater company, was to have a youth component of it so that we could replicate this feeling that it's not over there. You just come inside and you get started, So we had from the very beginning, we had outreach programs with kids all over the city, some of whom who'd sort of never been down to this part of town, and it was cool.
Wow.
It's very meaningful. Again, very meaningful to be able to do that.
I'm really curious. You said you were kind of, well, you didn't use this word. I'm putting this on you, shy, because you were sitting under the table reading. So that's my characterization. You can tell me how.
No, that's a pretty good surmise.
Okay. So based on that, acting, I'm only basing this on myself. I'm an okay actor. I'm a fine comedic actor. I can deliver a joke. I'm bad when it comes to anything else. Anything that's actually deeper. And it's because I'm ashamed of emoting in public. If I, unless the emotions are so I can't stop them from, grief or something like that. And I'm kind of curious how you took to that, whether you were able to, did you have to do some work to get to a certain place? When you were younger?
Well, you've talked to a lot of actors. You must have noticed that a lot of actors are sort of shy. It's a weird thing that actors can be shy in life. That's true. That's true. There are actors who are very extroverted, but there is a certain category of actors who are actually fundamentally shy, I guess, or introverted, which might or might not be the same thing. But that being in a play, you have words, you know who you are for those 2 hours. You're not actually feeling self-conscious because you are being someone else. And I think there's something about it for a lot of introverts that is actually kind of more relaxing than having to go to a party and be yourself, There's something about it that's freeing. And even, I've been doing a lot of improv in the last 10 years, and it's the same thing. It's the lack of self-consciousness that is such a drug, not to be feeling like it's all about you, but to be creating something with other people.
Yes. Well, I love group mind from improv. But I think, and I guess this is where I'm curious. I am worried that when I act, someone will see something in me that I didn't want them to see. That even if I'm playing a character, I'm putting myself in some way into that character.
Yeah.
And I think that scares me, but it didn't scare you.
I got to be better as an actor because I had a mentor director who called me on that and said, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid that people are going to see what you really look like when you're crying? And I thought, yeah, I am.
Yeah.
But then I realized that was the hurdle that I had to get over. Is people aren't really thinking about you that way that's when you really disappear into the character, when you bring those personal weird tics and things that you think if you put them at the service of a character, you don't have to worry about it. If you can it's a knack in a way, or the trick. I think acting sometimes is a knack that you just go through that door and decide that that's okay, and actually that is fun and freeing to say, oh, it's not me up there. It's me being that character, me at another address, basically, with a different life story. And therefore, it's all okay because it's not me somehow. It's a weird thing, but somehow that being given that sort of clear ultimatum of if you want to be an actor, you have to stop doing the pretty version of you when you're feeling bereft, you have to do, and then people won't think it's you, and it won't be embarrassing, weirdly.
So, okay. I don't know if I'm middle-aged. I don't know if I can hear that now. I'm like, oh, do I have to change myself? Do I have to now?
Yeah, there you go.
Be a different person, and now I have to
resistance. I know.
Grieve this. It really that almost, you saying that, it almost felt like early on when I was in therapy, and my therapist would say something, and I'd be like, so I got to change now? Is that what you're telling me? Now I got to be a different person?
I'm paying you this money for that? That's ridiculous.
There is a certain, like, I live my life with a certain kind of vanity that you necessarily have to push down if you're going to truly embody a character. If you're going to be a real actor, you kind of have to, like, just let go of that. Question mark.
Well, it's interesting. Good question mark, because actors have egos, obviously, very strong egos, and a certain kind of vanity, but it might not be the everyday vanity of, needing to look perfect. But that's for a bigger vanity, maybe, where you're like, but I'll be fabulous in that moment if I can just really let go or something. It's an odd... I'm fascinated by the psychology of actors, which is why I wrote Slings and Arrows. But I'm fascinated because I can experience it and I still don't understand it. There's a line there's a beautiful moment in Ingmar Bergman's autobiography, The Magic Lantern, where he talks about being a kid and he was allowed to go backstage and he watched this, legendary character actor standing in the wings, smoking a cigarette, talking and laughing, and then butting out the cigarette and walking out into the light and being a different person. And he was fascinated by that liminal moment of like, what happens in that moment? And I'm fascinated by that moment too. I've experienced it.
Yeah.
It feels like magic sometimes. I don't know why I want to do it. I should be, off stage, being a stage manager, but there's some ego or vanity in my part that kind of wants to be the center of attention sometimes.
Yeah. Yes, so I've never experienced it in terms of like being a real actor, but I've experienced it as a comedian, and my wife is a stand-up, and she's great. So I've seen her go from being just like standing backstage to she walks on stage and, some kind of mental switch is flipped.
Amazing.
And I've experienced it to a lower level, but to walk out, and it is something about that context. I think it has to be, right?
Yeah.
It has to be something about that space and the space of performance that allows it to happen. Although, can't you do it? I was thinking about this. I had a meeting the other day, and you turn it on for a meeting. Like, you're charismatic in a meeting in a way that, like, I was on a Zoom, and then it went from me just sitting here looking at Instagram to me being somewhat charming, I guess I could say. So, yeah, and I don't know what that, because it is, I guess, in a certain sense, that's also a space of performance, right?
For sure it is, for sure. And I guess everybody has a version of this, whether they have to give a presentation or something, and they're like, I come alive, or I know lots of people can't imagine performing per se. That is a real terror for people, and I totally get it. And I've had really bad stage fright once in my life, to the point where I thought, I don't know if I can do this again, and I sort of figured out how to manage it, because it's actually quite a dangerous thing. And the reason, there's a great book by Keith Johnstone, who was a legendary improv teacher who taught a lot of the kids in the hall. He wrote this beautiful book called Impro about. Have you read it? Do you know it?
I've heard of it. It was part of when I read the Del Close book, and I read some other ones from the Chicago folks, but I never got.
You should read that one, because there's a lot of interesting thoughts about what improvisation is like that he was such a deep thinker about it, beyond just and he created theater sports and all kinds of stuff. But one of the things he talks about is masks and faces. I think it's in that book. And it's about how in so many cultures there's this putting on of the mask, but there's usually a ritual around it, because it's actually there's the respect for the mask. Even if you ever do mask work with the French, it's you have to address the mask, because there's this sense that there's some risk in putting on the mask, and you want to go through the rituals so that you'll be able to take the mask off. So that I think so you'll remember that you're still there, even while the mask won't take you over.
Huh.
And I came to believe that stage fright is when you don't know if you can take the mask off. Like there's some disconnect between the puppet and the puppeteer, and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And you don't usually, and people are watching, so you can't go like, excuse me 1 second, let's just go and adjust my mask. There's something deeply kind of risky psychologically, which is why people have backstage rituals, and it's a respectful thing I bet comics have this as well. There's kind of things you do just to make sure you're, like, to try and make the voodoo come out right.
Yeah. I mean, I did stuff at UCB in New York, and, you definitely, before you get on stage, everyone pats each other back, like, I got your back. So that, like, the person, like, you can say something and someone will be there to yes and you, so you're never going to, like, say something that's just going to be silence, and people like, what was that?
Yeah. Look at you.
which is the worst part of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is interesting then. I am curious, when you were growing up, did you feel like you had a real ego? And I mean that both, like, just in, like, a sense of self and also a kind of, like, ego in that way. If you know what I mean. Sorry, for the listener, I raised my eyebrow. I was, like, supercilious a little bit.
It's funny, I think probably people who knew me or saw me and would have thought, oh, she's very self-effacing, and, but that's the thing. I think that's why, because I think that's just the camouflage. I think that's what I'm sort of coming to terms with, and happily, that's just how you get by as a certain type of person, and maybe as a girl in a certain time period, to be good and and keep your head down, and nobody's good. But meanwhile, you have all these thoughts about who you are and what you want to do, and how rebellious thoughts, and all of which is kind of healthy, actually. But you just haven't figured out that it's okay to show that side of yourself. So, sometimes I often think, the most relaxing character to play in the world is somebody very self-absorbed, because it's like, oh, I don't have to think about anyone else. It's sort of almost like, is this me actually? Like, is this the real me? Like, just a very self-absorbed person who's just liberated from having to think, is everybody okay? Well, I don't know.
That is enjoyable.
Yeah.
If you think about, like, in those moments in your own life where you're like, oh, I can just think about what I want.
Yeah, it's not how I was brought up.
Yeah,
but
but I don't have any other moral or personal concerns. I can just okay, great. But then again, that life, I don't know. Oh, sorry. I always think back to in Annie Hall, there's a moment where Alvy is on the street and he's interviewing this, like, kind of like stereotypical pretty couple, and he's like, well, how do you make it work? And they're like, well, we don't think about anything. We're very surfacey hedonists. I mean, that's not the line, but it's like, but I think about that a lot. I'm just like, is that true? Is that like, if I were to deep dive into just that kind of self-absorbed hedonistic lifestyle, can I do that? Would I end up like that person? Does it matter? I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's meaningful. Is it meaningful for them? I have all these questions about being other people. Is that meaningful for them? And they live a meaningful life, and it just looks thin to me. And then I like that moment in Annie Hall, because I'm like, you're really showing these people for what they are, just like empty husks.
Well, it's satire. I think it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I don't think those people would ever be philosophy professors. That's not meaningful to them. It's a mystery why people, it's like what I said. It's like, for some people, acquiring endless amounts of money is actually just meaning enough, apparently, and it's fun, and 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 maybe when they, as maybe they, probably everybody has a course correction at some point where you think, oh, apparently money won't protect you from cancer or something like that, or divorce or whatever. But some people are more ruminative, clearly. Some people think a lot more about things like this than other people. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And maybe, yeah, a lot of people don't think about life like this. And some of them, I know very well and love very well, but they're like, I don't know why you're spending so much time worrying about this, because I can't invest in it. It doesn't mean that much to me, as it clearly does to you. So isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Where was the negative and the positive reinforcement coming from when you were younger?
Well, I had a lot of positive, not only in my family, but some mentors from outside my family. One of whom I wrote a book about. It's this guy, that lovely older man who lived next door to us when I was growing up at the cottage that we lived in, who was a retired history and English teacher, and he just had a gift for children. We used to play chess together and garden together, and he introduced me to Shakespeare and poetry, and and that's as important, I think, for kids sometimes, to have someone who's outside of their family who sees them as maybe not possible in your own family.
Yeah. We
were certainly encouraged to, when we were growing up, do all the things that we wanted to do to get as much education, and so that was never an issue. There was a kind of, I can, probably see now that there was I think it was very much in my culture, which is the WASP culture of the Midwest, that being excessive was thought to be very dangerous. To be excessively emotional or excessively dramatic or all those things. I really think that people thought, as people always do, is like, that will be a problem for you later in life, so we'll set you straight when you're young. And that nobody thought you could make a career out of it, that kind of thing. So for the most part, I will say that, I didn't become a writer for a long time because for various reasons, I really thought, oh, you have to be a genius to be a writer. And, clearly I'm not. And
you're a great writer. Don't.
Well, the whole myth of genius is such an obstacle to people. It's like, who knows? Why don't you start? Do you want to try? Like, get over yourself. Just try. And the problem is that you won't know until you keep going. So I think genius is just like a dogged determination to keep going and finding out and learning and getting better at it, and not to stop when your first effort disappoints you, but to keep going. And I think I bought into that for a little while, and and I had a high school teacher who was kind of dismissive, and I thought, well, no, like you, I'm not going to embarrass myself by putting myself out there anymore. I'll just write, but I wrote all the time for myself and just never had any idea of sharing it. So that was a big change for me in my midlife crisis, was starting to write and thinking, like, I really like this. And do I dare to show it to anybody? Or, how would I even do that? But then having kind of a gut thing of like, I got to do something else. Like acting was now, it was, especially theater. I had small children and we'd started this theater company, and my husband at the time was the artistic director. So like, I couldn't be out every night. And I was tired of waiting for people to give me jobs and all that kind of classic stuff. So I needed to do something else, and then found that I liked it. So was that enough of a reason to keep doing it? It turns out it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask, what was that moment like? Because that seems to me pivotal in your life. Mm-hmm. Like what? I understand. I'm condensing it to a moment. I'm sure it was a process, but do you remember how that feeling emerged from yourself?
There was a couple of things. One was, well, honestly, one was when a dear friend died, and I was at the funeral, and he died way too young, and I was talking to a friend who was a writer, and I said, I have this one idea, but I think I have to wait another 10 years to write it. And he said, don't wait 10 years. Like, there's never the right time. You got to start now. like get over yourself. And that was the first thing, was this little book that I wrote, which was based on this true story that happened to me. And then the next thing was a friend had the rights to a book that we loved, or was involved in it, and they couldn't get it off the ground. They needed to write a grant application or something, and I suddenly went, we could do that. Like just that light bulb moment of, I love that book. I'd love to be involved. I don't know how. And then instead of writing sort of a grant application, we wrote a script because we didn't know how to write an outline. But it was just that thing of, oh, this is so interesting. So sometimes it's just that gut feeling of, like you're so, often I think it's, you're so frustrated with the way things are that you're willing to take a risk. So I often think it's really good sometimes to get to a point of frustration or even grief about the way things are, or loss about, I didn't get what I wanted. Like there were things that were disappointing in my life. But it's such a great thing if you can seize that and say, I'm not, ego, I'm not going to let them tell me who I am. Like I'm going to find that kind of fuck you energy of like,
yeah.
I think there's something really to be said for that moment where you decide, I refuse to let that define me. I'm going to try this, even if my grade 10 teacher didn't think I was a very good writer.
We're right at the end, and I'm kind of curious because you said your neighbor introduced you to Shakespeare. My mom, before she retired, she was an English teacher, and that was what her main focus. She taught Shakespeare. Well, one of the main things she taught. And when I encountered it as a kid, it was so foreign to me, it didn't resonate in any way. And it had to be as an adult seeing actually good actors perform it, where I'm like, oh, okay, so that's it. And I'm curious. And it was the same thing. Like when I remember reading Sartre's essay on existentialism in high school, not understanding a single word and just being like, well, I read it, so check mark. And then encountering it in college and being like, oh, this is amazing. Okay. So I'm kind of curious how it was introduced to you and what was your response then? And then how, or at what point did it click for you?
So he introduced it to me without me knowing I was learning Shakespeare. It was part of a story that he wrote to me. The premise of the book is that summer when I was 5, he wrote, I received letters every day from a fairy who was living in this old stone fireplace between us, and she was banished from her home in Peru because she had to tell the children about the fairies, and her aunt Queen Mab and her uncle King Oberon and her cousin Puck, and it was full of these sort of stories of these characters, and incidentally full of beautiful pieces of Shakespeare, like I Know a Bank Where the Wild Thyme Glows, where Oxliff and the Notting, that was in these letters. And then he would explain to me, that little road up to Blueberry Mountain, when we found the snake skin, that's what they're talking about in that poem. So it was the most brilliant so it was years later that I realized, when I was in high school English probably and studying Midsummer Night's Dream, I was like, oh, I know these characters. I know this poetry. I know those lines. It already was alive in my imagination. And in fact, the first play I did out of theater school was Midsummer Night's Dream. So that's one way. I think introducing children, I have friends who teach Shakespeare, if they don't know it's good for them, if they're just learning about the characters, like they love Macbeth, they love Hamlet, because the story is immediately riveting. What would you do if 3 witches told you, or a ghost appeared and said that, your father was murdered? What would you do? No, it's not safe to do that. So I think, and really young children don't, as I gather with some ESL classes, they don't know the language is harder than other language because they haven't gotten used to the idea. So I think it's a little bit how you approach it. High school is too late, basically. Mm-hmm. It's better to get kids on board with the characters and the stories, and then they're curious enough to try and figure out, well, why do they talk like that? My daughter's a tutor, and she was teaching this kid who was not interested in Shakespeare. By the end of the class, he kept saying, how did he think of all that? How did he, we have to lose the idea that it's good for you, and more like, it's so fun if you can get into it.
Yeah. Well, the way that a lot of, again, I can't speak for Canada, but certainly here in America, everything is kind of like wrung in school, in public school at least, is wrung out any kind of meaning, any kind of significance, and it's just like, well, you're supposed to know this, so hear this. Like, or like, I just remember reading Midsummer Night's Dream, like we read it in class, and I was Puck, and I just remember being terrified of screwing up, and so it's not like I understood anything about it until later, and I was just like worried that I was gonna not read the line correctly, even though it was right in front of me, and it was not like I was like, I didn't have to memorize it. But
this is a recipe for turning kids off Shakespeare, basically.
Yeah, for sure. But I like the way that you were introduced to it, because it seems to me that like that's a great way to get people interested in something. I remember there was some song I heard had some lyrics that later when I read Waiting for Godot, I found out were lines from Waiting for Godot. And I'm like, oh, and instantly, I mean, I love Beckett, so it's not like I had to really do a ton of more, but like just having that connection, like from when I was younger in my head, made me infinitely more interested in it. Yeah. In a way that I like that you were introduced to it in a very surreptitious way, let's say, when you were younger, that then suddenly this thing clicks in your head when you're actually reading the play in high school.
It's like when you speak about reading, existentialism. I remember getting to university and studying intellectual history and philosophy and then noticing people had actual questions that they came to class with, like they'd been thinking about these things and thinking, oh, that makes it come a lot, like, oh, this actually could be about my life, could be about how I'm living my life. And then it came alive much more to me as like, oh, I never thought about it that way. Like, this could be, I have these problems already. This could actually help me solve those problems as opposed to being a dry mathematical exercise.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, I think we solved it then. Okay, there's two things. One, you have to embed pieces of intellectual works, however you want to. You have to embed them in people's actual lived existences early on in their lives. And then the second thing is you have to teach them as meaningful works as opposed to dry, logical exposition.
Yeah. Yes. So we're full circle. Well done. We're back to meaning. You're an expert, clearly.
Thank you so much. What an absolute delight it was to talk with you.
It's a pleasure. It's such an interesting conversation that we've had. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, oh, 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 bye.